Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. So first of all, my name is Anu Sood, and I'm the Director of Marketing at CaseWare RCM and today's moderator. In a recent address, FinCEN Director Kenneth Blanco stated that nearly 500 federal, state, and local law enforcement and regulatory agencies have access to FinCEN's database of BSA records. And within these agencies, there are an estimated 11,000 active users of BSA data. Now, over 20% of FBI investigations use BSA data, and for some types of crime, including organized crime, that number is nearly 60%. And finally, out of the 97 recent domestic terrorism cases reviewed by FinCEN, 25 of them had BSA reporting prior to a person's arrest. Now, with so many people reviewing SARs and their potential value, it's very important that you pay careful attention to the information that you're submitting in the suspicious activity reports. And that is what we will be discussing today. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention a little bit about Alessa. So Alessa is an integrated AML compliance solution that offers customer due diligence, sanction screening, transaction monitoring, and regulatory reporting, including that for FinCEN. Our solution is not only used by banks, but also MSBs, FinTechs, and gaming institutions. We offer a host of benefits, including the ability to integrate your data from various AML systems, so you can get a holistic view of your risks, as well as the ability to integrate with a number of providers, so you can have the tools you need to be able to have a risk-based approach to your AML compliance. Now, if you'd like to have more information about our product, you can drop us a note or visit our website at alessa.caseware.com. Now, our presenter today is Laurie Kelly. And Laurie has a 35-year career spanning the fields of accounting, finance, risk management, and regulatory compliance. Most recently, from 2006 to 2018, she served as the Director of Compliance for CoBank ACB, a $136 billion farm credit system institution, and where she developed and managed the bank's anti-money laundering, fraud, and economic sanctions compliance programs. She holds CAM's designation as well as CAM's audit specialization. She helped found the ACAM's Colorado chapter, serving as its executive board chair from 2016 to 2018, and programs director from 2015 to 2016. So with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Laurie.
Well, thank you, Anu, and once again, welcome everyone to our webinar on Effective Suspicious Activity Report, or SAR, writing. Now, my goal today is to help you see SAR writing from what may be a new and different perspective. My proposition to you today is that when we understand who is using the information presented in a SAR, how these users obtain SAR reports and data, and for what purposes, we as anti-money laundering professionals can craft SARs to make them most effective in their ultimate purpose, which is fighting crime. Now, I do want to emphasize that everything I'm sharing today is from a US perspective. So if you're based outside the US, please keep that in mind. However, most of what I'll be discussing today is relevant to everyone, regardless of locale. To that effect, our presentation today will start with a discussion of why SAR quality is so important. And next, I'll give you some insights, again from a US perspective, of who may be reading your SAR. We'll then review a couple of significant money laundering cases where financial institution SARs were instrumental to law enforcement in ultimately prosecuting the offenders. We'll discuss some very important aspects of effective SAR writing, in particular, writing for the reader. And finally, I'll offer you a tool that you may find very beneficial in your SAR processes. We'll wrap up with a summary of key takeaways and then have some Q&A time. So to underscore the importance of today's topic, here are a few rather staggering statistics. In 2018, there were over 2.8 million SARs filed with the US Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, across all types of filing institutions. Now, with an average of 261 working days in a year, that represents just over 10,800 SARs filed every business day. I don't know about you, but I sometimes have a hard time wrapping my head around that number. And what's also interesting is that SARs have only been filed electronically for just over 7 years when e-filing became mandatory in July of 2012. So as you can imagine, the advent of e-filing has brought about a whole new world of financial intelligence data for law enforcement, for counterterrorism agencies, and for financial regulators as well. Now, the value of any data is only as good as its quality. The content and the quality of the data in a suspicious activity report is no different. So by understanding who is using the information presented in a SAR, how they're getting it, and for what purposes they're using it, we can craft SARs to make them most effective for their ultimate purpose, which is fighting crime. So with 2.8 million or more SARs filed in a year, is it even remotely possible that the SAR you filed will be read by someone? Well, surprisingly, yes. There's actually a fairly high probability that your SAR will eventually be read by a person, either proactively after it's filed or through data mining. So who might read your SAR? Well, one possibility is a SAR review team. Now, there are currently over 100 of these teams located throughout the US. Their job is to proactively review new SARs filed in their designated geographic areas. A typical SAR review team is made up of law enforcement representatives from IRS Criminal Investigations, or IRS-CI as we call it, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration, and also the US Secret Service. Now, the team might also include members from the US Attorney's Office, state and local law enforcement, or even regulatory agencies. And these SAR review teams meet on a periodic basis depending upon the volume of SAR submitted. And typically one law enforcement agency is the lead for each review team, and this is often IRS-CI. The lead agency downloads SARs to be reviewed from the FinCEN database, and then they're divided up amongst the various team members based on violation code. Now, given the high volume of SARs filed and limited resources available to them, most SAR review teams use a variety of targeted selection criteria to choose the reports they'll review. So this may be dollar amount, type of criminal activity, specific keywords used in the report narrative, whether the report is new versus continuing activity, etc. Many different variables. There are also special teams called SAR review task forces. Now, unlike the SAR review teams whose members have day jobs, SAR review task forces are made up of agents and officers who are devoted entirely to SAR reviews. This is their only job. There are about 25 SAR review task forces in place today, and they're based in large metropolitan areas. Now, the task forces operate very much like review teams, except that they review every SAR submitted in their geographical coverage area. The SARs they review might then be selected for further investigation, either by IRS-CI or another agency, based on the type of underlying criminal activity. Now, one other way your SAR may be read is through data mining of FinCEN's SAR database. FinCEN analysts research and analyze SAR and CTR, which is currency transaction report, information, and other critical forms of intelligence to support financial crime investigations. FinCEN effectively has one of the largest repositories of information that's available to law enforcement in the US because of how they can link a variety of databases together with the SAR and CTR database. So law enforcement can query data in this repository, either for proactive purposes or specific cases they're working on. FinCEN can provide a financial intelligence report on a particular subject that includes their financial transactions, identifiers like their driver's license number, social security number, their assets, travel records, and criminal records. Through this data mining process, they can analyze connections between various subjects, map the money flows, and track the suspicious activities. They can also find the specific SAR or SARs filed by financial institutions that identify the suspicious activity. So this really is big data, And the advent of SAR electronic filing is what's made this possible. It's important to recognize that every day cases are successfully investigated and prosecuted based on the SARs that we're filing. For the past 5 years, FinCEN has held an annual awards program to recognize the importance of SAR and CTR reporting by financial institutions. At the most recent awards ceremony in May of this year, Sigal P. Mandelker, who's the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, said, amongst other things, that the cases recognized today make clear that BSA data, in other words, SAR and CTR data, is critical in the fight against financial crime. And every year there have been a number of significant cases recognized, and I'd like to summarize a couple of these for you. One case involved a 3-year investigation into an illegal online Bitcoin exchange. Now, this was a very complex case, which would take a whole hour to explain, but just in summary, it involved criminals taking over a small credit union in order to facilitate funds transfers of over $60 million to and from this Bitcoin exchange. They were laundering money that came from ransomware schemes, fraud, and bribery, as well as the proceeds from the theft of personal data from over 100 million people stolen from US financial institutions. And ultimately, there were 7 people who were successfully prosecuted in this case. The second award-winning case was a multi-agency investigation between the US and Mexico. And this involved a fraud and a trade-based money laundering scheme that moved over $100 million in illegal funds through the US financial system. 2 of the co-conspirators were professional money launderers for the Sinaloa cartel, and they would wire large sums from Mexico through bank accounts held by Mexican and US shell companies, with only small amounts withdrawn from these accounts for quote-unquote business expenses. They were trying to make illegal activity appear to be legitimate as international trade in cell phones. There were multiple co-conspirators across the US who established shell companies and bank accounts. They rented virtual offices, they created websites for their shell companies, and they created phony invoices and import-export documents to give to US Customs. So in both of these cases, SAR and CTR data was instrumental in bringing down the criminals. And I can also share with you that throughout my 13 years in AML compliance, I was directly contacted by law enforcement on many of my SARs, from the FBI to DEA to Homeland Security and even a US military agency's Office of Investigations. But there's one specific example that's always stood out to me as an illustration of the power of FinCEN data. My bank had received what we immediately identified as a fraudulent fax message, where they were attempting to impersonate one of our business customers and requesting a $22,000 wire transfer to somebody in Russia. Now, we of course never sent any money out, but we did file a SAR. We noticed that in the header of the fax message, what would automatically be placed there by a fax machine, there was a man's name, and this name appeared to be Eastern European. So we included this name as a subject on our SAR and also mentioned him in the narrative. We filed the SAR electronically, and it wasn't even 48 hours later that an FBI agent contacted me about this SAR. It turns out that this agent had been tracking and investigating this individual ever since he entered the US from the Czech Republic 6 months before. The agent had established an alert in the FinCEN database to immediately flag any report with this guy's name. Apparently, he'd been running various scams involving cybercrime, counterfeit checks, insurance fraud, and so forth. And the agent told me that our SAR gave him a big break in this case. And everyone on my team was elated about how this one little SAR could make such a big difference. So to be most effective in the ultimate purpose of fighting financial crime, SAR must be written for its reader, who is law enforcement. This means that we must provide the most critical information succinctly, clearly, and logically, so the reader can quickly grasp the nature of the case, how much money is involved, and who are the key players. And perhaps even more importantly, we must provide the underlying nuances of the activity that make it suspicious. Now, I don't want to understate the importance of the various checkboxes, drop-downs, and other data entry fields on the SAR form. The data that we enter in these fields is really the foundation on which the house, if you will, is built. And it's here that we provide as much objective data as we can about the subject or subjects and the nature of the activity that we're reporting. FinCEN has revised the SAR form several times since the original e-filing form came out in 2012, including just recently, and they have expanded the number of checkboxes and other objective list-based sections in order to make data capture and analysis more robust and more granular. But when it comes to these checkboxes, use them judiciously. Don't check every single box that the suspicious activity you're reporting might fall under. Instead, choose only the most relevant one. Again, remember who's using this data, how it's being stored and organized. The quality of the data diminishes when there's too much of it to make good sense out of. The narrative section is really the key to the entire report. And it's here that we must grab the reader's attention. And we describe the nuances that aren't obvious from the names, account numbers, and other objective data on the form. We can also use keywords when they're applicable to help flag activity of significant concern to FinCEN. We'll talk more about keywords in an upcoming slide. To truly write for the reader, the narrative should be much more than just a reiteration of information that's already reflected elsewhere in the report. Instead, the narrative should specifically highlight the nuances of the activity that aren't reflected in the numbers and the names. And most importantly, the narrative should give the reader, law enforcement, a good understanding of why the activity you're reporting is suspicious and SAR-worthy. Remember those SAR review team and SAR review task force members? They're reading thousands of reports. So it's critical that you immediately capture their attention in the first sentence or two or three of your narrative. Do this by succinctly summarizing what is the activity, how you found it, and why you think it's SAR-worthy. Once you have this attention-grabbing opener, you can then go into more detail. As you craft the narrative, think about the aspects of the case that law enforcement would be interested in. In other words, things that aren't readily apparent from the data in the other form sections. For example, this might even include details such as a person's behavior, their physical appearance, or even unusual comments or questions or requests that they may have made to a bank staff member. Sometimes these elements could even indicate a human trafficking or elder abuse situation. Now, transaction activity frequently is considered suspicious when it's out of pattern for a customer based on if it's a commercial client, the type of business, or historical account activity, and so forth. In these cases, talk about why the activity is so unusual for that customer. One example might be a local retail business customer with no history of wire transfers or foreign transactions who suddenly begins receiving wires from senders and banks in South America and Eastern Europe. It's also helpful to law enforcement when you describe anything odd or unusual about the transactions themselves, especially with wire transfers. For instance, wires for round amounts of $25,000 to $50,000, because these amounts are often thought by criminals to fly under the radar of banks' monitoring systems. Also, odd, unusual, or inappropriate verbiage in the originator to beneficiary information, or OBI field, or in the reference for the beneficiary, or RFB field. Now, if you're not familiar with wire transfers, these are optional free-form text fields meant to help the recipient identify the purpose of the funds. Now, I once had at my bank a suspicious incoming wire transfer to a business customer for $50,000, where the OBI message was, quote, for Sony home theater system, model number something, something, something. So we actually looked up the model number and found it was a real Sony home theater system, but it was sold only in the UK and retailing for around $1,200 US. What really topped this suspicious activity off, though, was that this wire was sent to a produce grower from what we determined was an obvious shell company in the UK, and it originated from a bank in Latvia. Now, you really don't get much more suspicious than that. Also, if you do ask your customer for an explanation of the activity, be sure to include their response in the narrative as well, along with the name of the person who said it. One last comment in this list of do's for SAR narratives. Please use concise and simple language in an active tense to cut down the word count. Remember your reader and how many SARs they have to read every day. So since we have a list of do's, we also naturally need a list of don'ts. So here are the big ones. Don't repeat information in the narrative that's already in another part of the form, unless it's especially relevant to telling the story. For example, don't state your financial institution's name or its location or its total assets, etc. Same goes with subjects' account numbers, addresses, telephone numbers, and the like. Don't include a lengthy list of every transaction and all its nitty-gritty details. Now, this was something that regulators often demanded before the advent of the SAR attachment feature, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So sometimes some of us well-seasoned compliance folks may still think this type of information is required in the narrative. But even before the attachment feature came about, I heard many law enforcement agents say that they hated when SAR narratives had this type of detail because it added no value and it just took up space. Something else to avoid in your narratives is excessively verbose, passive tense language. Now, some people may feel this sounds more professional or more formal, but really it's of no help to anyone. So for example, instead of saying a wire transfer in the amount of $50,000, just say a $50,000 wire transfer. Or instead of a wire transfer for the benefit of customer X, just say a wire transfer to customer X. So you get the idea. But on the other hand, you don't want to provide too little information. Make sure your reader has enough detail to clearly understand what happened, who did it, how much, and why this is suspicious. So to really bring home these concepts, let's look at a SAR narrative example. So here's an example of a fictitious, I'm assuming, SAR narrative that is very, very poorly written. This example actually came from a FinTech publication from several years ago, where they were discussing writing effective SAR narratives. And as I read it to you, think about everything you see wrong with this write-up, and then we'll have a little bit of fun picking it apart. First Federal Bank is filing this SAR in connection with possible suspicious payments to ABC Corporation originating from XYZ LLC. This review of the transactions that led to the filing of this SAR was prompted by an alert from the bank's payment monitoring system for Century Bank concerning transfers on behalf of its client XYZ LLC. Century Bank is a correspondent banking client of First Federal. First Federal records reveal that from June 29, 2019 to August 1, 2019, 4 payments totaling $13,675.21 were transmitted to ABC Corporation at Century Bank. ABC Corporation is being used to repatriate funds to Venezuela. As of March 2, 2019, ABC Corporation does not appear on FinCEN's MSB registration list. Okay, who? What? I must have read this at least a couple dozen times, and I still can't figure out what they're trying to say. But let's look at some of the more glaring issues. First sentence, First Federal Bank is filing this SAR. No, really? We had no idea, except for that first part of the form where the bank's name goes. Next, they say, in connection with possible suspicious payments. Okay, are they suspicious or not? No, they're just possibly suspicious. We're not really sure yet. I wonder if the lawyers made them use that word possibly, kind of like an allegedly when you're talking about a crime, except being suspicious is not a crime as far as I know. This review of the transactions that led to the filing of the SAR was prompted by an alert from the bank's payment monitoring system for Century Bank concerning transfers on behalf of its client XYZ LLC. No kidding, you have a payment monitoring system and it generates alerts? That is so cool. But it only works for Century Bank? Who's Century Bank? Oh, wait, in the next sentence, they tell us that Century Bank is a correspondent banking client of theirs. Okay. Then they go on to describe in minute detail the payments involved, and they keep mentioning ABC Corporation, but who are they? Are they First Federal's client? No, wait, they say ABC Corporation has an account at Century Bank. But I thought XYZ was Century Bank's customer. I don't know about you, but I am totally confused. Then at the very end, they drop this bombshell that ABC Corporation is being used to repatriate funds to Venezuela. Wait, what? How the heck do they know that? And where's the word allegedly? Because that's a pretty serious accusation. Then they wrap it up with a tidbit about ABC Corporation not being a registered MSB. Okay, so what? Anyway, so that was a little fun. Now, FinCEN didn't publish a better version of this crummy narrative, so I decided I'd rewrite it myself. I had to use my imagination a bit to fill in the blanks. I drew upon some of my real-life SARs to put together this improved version. Customer XYZ LLC, a local dry cleaner and laundry establishment, sent 4 outgoing wire transfers totaling $13,675.21 within a 4-week period to an account at Banco de Venezuela, Caracas office, to beneficiary ABC Corporation, an apparent Panama-based shell company. These payments are highly out of pattern for XYZ LLC, which has never sent or received a single wire transfer in its 8-year history with the bank. XYZ LLC is a cash-intensive business and a high-risk customer for whom the bank closely monitors all transaction activity. ABC Corporation appears on Panama's National Companies Registry with a physical address matching that of a law firm in Panama City used by hundreds of other legal entities per the bank's internet research. Mr. Roberto Alvarez, the owner and sole member of XYZ LLC, has stated to bank personnel that the payments were for purchases of cleaning supplies. The payments did not include any explanatory messages such as invoice numbers or other references as to purpose. Complete transaction details are provided in the attachment to this SAR. Supporting documentation is available upon request. So you can see how I've summarized the whole gist of the case in the first 3 sentences. It should be clear that these payments to Venezuela are way out of pattern for a local dry cleaner and that the receiver looks to be a Panama shell company. Then in the next paragraph, I give some additional details that aren't reflected anywhere else. I say how I ascertained that ABC Corporation is quite likely a Panama shell company. I also throw in what the customer, through the owner of the business, told us in explanation for these payments. And then I succinctly expand on why that explanation seems, well, pretty lame. In the final paragraph, I remind law enforcement that there's an attachment to this SAR where they can get all the details of the transactions, and I tell them that I'm more than happy to give them all my supporting documentation if they want to ask for it. Much better, yes? Now I'd like to speak briefly about 2 items relating to the narrative, the attachment feature and using keywords. First, let's talk about keywords. Technically, these are called advisory key terms, because they stem from FinCEN advisories relating to specific types of illegal activities. These key terms are specific words that FinCEN wants us to use in SAR narratives when the report involves activity related to a FinCEN advisory. So for example, the very first key term was foreign corruption, and it stemmed from an April 2008 FinCEN advisory titled Proceeds of Foreign Corruption. Since then, there have been over 20 additional advisories and other FinCEN publications that request the use of specific keywords, such as TBML, which stands for Trade-Based Money Laundering, Funnel Account, Advisory Human Trafficking, etc. And this is a list of all of them right now. I've noted some of the more frequently used ones in red. Now, some of these are a bit cryptic, so you'll want to visit FinCEN's website page for a complete list of all the keywords and the hyperlinks to their related advisories. It's important to be aware of these keywords and to use them in your narratives where they apply. These keywords help the SAR readers and database queries to quickly identify SARs on high priority illegal activities. And at my bank, we even would put these keywords in all caps in our narratives to further highlight them. In April 2013, FinCEN released an updated version of the electronic SAR form. One of the many enhancements was this attachment feature. It lets us attach a single CSV or comma-separated value file to a SAR to document transactions or other details that are too numerous to include in the narrative. For example, every field on a series of wire transfers, or say a detailed list of counterfeit checks with dates, payee names, amounts, and so forth. And the beauty of the attachment is that it lets us include extensive details without adding excess length to the narrative. It's important to mention in your narrative that there is an attachment to the SAR. Apparently, the attachment isn't something obvious to SAR readers, meaning they would have to go looking for it. When we tell them there's an attachment, they don't have to waste time guessing or looking for one that's not there. And although it may seem obvious, I do want to emphasize that the attachment is not meant to be a substitute for the narrative itself. You still have to write that. Also, the same SAR confidentiality rules apply to the attachment as to the entire report. Now I'd like to talk about another topic that I believe is important to SAR's effectiveness, and that is the designation of the report as either new or continuing activity. So this is just a checkbox on the first page of the electronic SAR form, as you can see here. A new report means it's reporting new suspicious activity that's never occurred before. And a continuing activity report indicates that this is about ongoing activity by the same subjects, same nature, based on an original new SAR. Now, FinCEN has given us some guidance on when to file these continuing activity SARs. Once we file an original or new SAR, FinCEN tells us to keep monitoring for any repeat activity over the next 90 days. And if nothing happens in that 90-day period, we can close our case. But if there are more suspicious transactions, we should then file a continuing activity SAR to report any new transactions that occurred in that 90-day monitoring period. Now, they give us an extra 30 days to prepare and file the continuing activity SAR, so it effectively should be filed within 120 days of the date of the last SAR. And this process keeps going as long as there's more activity, so lather, rinse, repeat. Clearly, law enforcement would want to know when suspicious activity is ongoing, as it shows a pattern of illegal activity that could expand a criminal case beyond that of a one-time occurrence. In fact, FinCEN even encourages us to file a continuing activity SAR before the end of the 90-day monitoring period if it involves high-priority illegal activity, such as terrorist financing or large-scale human trafficking. But what happens when the activity reoccurs, but it's after the 90-day monitoring period ends? For example, say you have a US customer who receives a series of suspicious wire transfers from a bank in the Cayman Islands over a 3-day period, and then they immediately turn around and wire the funds in bulk to a third party in another country. These transactions are very out of pattern for this customer, so you file a SAR and you monitor the customer's accounts for more of the same type of transactions. 90 days goes by and there's no further activity. But then on the 112th day since the last suspicious transaction took place, the customer receives another similar series of foreign wires and does the same thing with the money again. Should your next SAR be new or continuing activity? Unfortunately, FinCEN has no written guidance on this issue. And I had a number of ongoing cases with multiple continuing activity SAR filings, some of which where the repeat activity happened several weeks to months after the most recent 90-day window had closed. I even phoned FinCEN on 2 of these cases where new activity had occurred just a few weeks outside the 90-day window. And of course, I got 2 different answers. One person said, call it new. Another said, call it continuing activity. Both said there wasn't any specific written guidance that I could refer to. Now, examiners seem to prefer a by-the-book approach to this, meaning the next SAR should be new if the 90-day monitoring period has passed. But I challenge this approach. If the purpose of the SAR is for law enforcement's use, would it not be more appropriate to denote the SAR as continuing activity, because that's in fact what's really happening? I chose to ignore the 90-day rule in favor of giving law enforcement the most meaningful information possible. In other words, calling it continuing activity, because that's exactly what it was. Same people, same behavior, same everything. So FinCEN clearly hasn't specifically addressed this issue. My recommendation to you, if you encounter this dilemma, is to make your own decision. But always remember the ultimate purpose of the SAR. Just be prepared to support your position, perhaps through a case report, which we'll talk about next. So as I've been saying, the SAR and its narrative section are meant to capture the highlights of a suspicious activity case, so law enforcement readers can make judgments on pursuing further investigations. The SAR also provides key information that facilitates FinCEN database research, meaning law enforcement may find your SAR at some later date. Now, typically, we conclude the SAR narrative with a statement that additional details are available upon request. This is because a suspicious activity case is so much more than checkboxes, keywords, and a summary. So what will you provide to law enforcement should they come asking for these additional details? So what exactly is a case report? Well, a case report is what I call a tool that I developed for my team to support our complex SAR cases. It's really a comprehensive report that provides all the details of a suspicious activity case and its related SAR filings all in one place. We developed standard formats for our case reports for money laundering cases and fraud cases, and we found this tool to have a number of benefits. First and foremost, it allowed us to quickly and efficiently deliver on law enforcement requests for a SAR case's full details. It also provides a comprehensive and detailed written report about a SAR case that can help management, an internal SAR review committee, examiners, or internal audit understand the nuances of the case. In other words, it removes the anecdotal aspect of explaining a SAR to those outside of compliance. And it's especially useful in continuing activity cases where you've got lots of details, multiple SARs filed, and potentially multiple law enforcement inquiries involved. Now, this was a big benefit for my team, as it also allowed us to transfer ownership of cases between associates pretty easily. Another benefit is that you can design the case report format to meet your institution's unique needs. And it can start as a template and then be modified as needed for a particular case's unique elements. Finally, it was a huge productivity enhancer in terms of making the SAR preparation, cross-checking, and review process much more efficient. Our process was for the associate who's developing the case, usually based on an alert or alerts from our transaction monitoring system, to write up all the details and nuances of the case in a case report, starting with a template and then modifying the template as needed to illustrate the specific nuances of the suspicious activity. One section of the report is a draft of the SAR narrative. The case report would then be referred to a supervisor for review and then to management for final approval to file the SAR. So if necessary, the reviewer could edit the narrative within the report. And after all the approvals were documented, the case report would be routed back to the associate to actually create the SAR form within our transaction monitoring system, where they could simply copy and paste the final approved narrative section from the case report into the SAR form record. Now, it's very important to keep these case reports confidential. In other words, restrict access to them just as you would a SAR form. That includes both any paper copies and electronic versions. Now, in the next few slides, I'll expand on the various sections that may be included in a case report and hopefully get you thinking about what you might include in your own version. The first section is a basic reference information section about the customer and the case itself. The date it was opened, dates of alerts, case number, category of suspicious activity, all these types of things that are helpful pieces of information to summarize. Section 2 is where we would capture all the detailed background information in a narrative format. Things like how the activity was detected. In other words, was it from an automated alert? Was it a verbal report by a teller? A fraudulent fax even? Also, describe here what types of follow-up activities were performed and by whom. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, here's where you'd provide as much detail as possible as to why this is SAR-worthy. If the customer or other party has been the subject of other SARs, you want to cross-reference them here as well. Now, section 3 is where we would put the detailed transaction history, especially when you have wire transfers or other electronic transfers involved. You want to list the originator and beneficiary names, their addresses and account numbers, names and locations of all the banks involved, and their identification numbers, meaning Fed routing numbers, SWIFT BIC codes, correspondent account numbers, etc. and then any verbiage in the originator to beneficiary or reference for beneficiary free-form text fields. Section 4 was a law enforcement communications log. It's important to track the date, name, title, contact details, and method of contact for each communication to or from any law enforcement representative regarding the case. Section 5 was a SAR filing log. Now, this provided a tracking record to document clearly that all regulatory deadlines were met. This became particularly important to us in continuing activity cases. So for each SAR filed on the case, we would record the date the activity was detected, the date the decision to file the SAR was made, the date the SAR was filed, and the next continuing activity SAR due date, which, as you may remember, is 120 days from the date of the last SAR. You might also want to record each SAR's unique BSA ID number for quick reference as well. Section 6 is the SAR narrative. As I mentioned previously, I always found it was much easier to draft the SAR narrative outside of the form itself or any form generating software. And the case report provides the perfect place to do this because all the details are in front of you. Also, when you include the final narrative verbatim in the case report, others who may be reviewing and or approving the SAR can read and edit the narrative along with all the supporting information readily accessible. Now, these have been the basic case report sections that I've found to be most helpful, but you can certainly design this report format in whatever way works best for you and your processes. So for example, if your institution has an internal SAR review committee that approves SAR filings, you could add an approvals log section to record the date the SAR was submitted for review and the date it was approved. So at this point, you may be wondering, why should you take the time and effort to create a standalone case report document when you have an automated suspicious activity monitoring and SAR case management system in place? Well, the answer to that question depends on the automated system's level of detail and accessibility of SAR case data. In all likelihood, you have a robust automated transaction monitoring system. But from a logistical and process perspective, the case report can provide significant added value when your automated system, for example, has limited capability to store free-form text notes, or you can't print a full report of all the notes entered. If the system doesn't retain the SAR narrative as a separate field, in other words, you must open the SAR form to read the narrative, or if it can't produce a summary report with content like that of a case report, which could be provided to law enforcement, internal management, examiners, or auditors, or if it can't maintain specific records of law enforcement communications. For instance, it may only be able to record these in a textual case note. Now, I'll close out this topic by saying that these case reports were extremely valuable to my bank for all the reasons I've mentioned. When we provided these reports to law enforcement, agents were always extremely complimentary of how thorough our reports were and how they really helped them understand the case. The same was true for our examiners and our auditors. Without the case reports, we would have had to have given them access to the transaction monitoring system and then teach them how to navigate it to get to the data they needed on the SAR cases they wanted to review. So we definitely felt that the extra effort we put into these reports was well worth it in the long run. So in conclusion, I'd like to remind you all again that when we set out to write a SAR, we need to always keep in mind the why. And that is, SARs are the ultimate reason for an anti-money laundering program. Their primary purpose is to deliver information to law enforcement promptly, concisely, and meaningfully so that potential crimes can be detected, investigated, and prosecuted. So in her remarks at the FinCEN 2015 Law Enforcement Awards ceremony, then FinCEN Director Jennifer Calvary stated very well just how important is the information we provide in our SAR filings. She said, BSA reports filed by our financial institutions provide some of the most important information available to law enforcement and other agencies safeguarding the United States. The reporting aids in expanding the scope of ongoing investigations by pointing to the identities of previously unknown subjects, exposing accounts and hidden financial relationships, or revealing other information such as common addresses or phone numbers that connects seemingly unrelated participants in a criminal or terrorist organization, and in some cases, even confirming the location of suspects. And finally, I'll close with one more quote, this one from John Byrne, Senior Advisor to the Advisory Board of ACAMS and Vice Chairman of AML RightSource. He says, the work we do as AML professionals impacts all aspects of society because economic effects have the potential to harm or help all strata throughout the world. We are charged with detecting, reporting, and preventing the misuse of monies or value of any kind that furthers crime in any fashion. The system that surrounds our requirements is by no means perfect, and we should do all we can to improve it. To me, this is truly the why of effective SAR writing. So let's quickly recap the takeaways from today's presentation. Your SAR will very likely be read, so write for your reader, law enforcement. Be sure to describe the nuances of the activity that aren't reflected in the checkboxes and the form and fill-in fields. Make sure your narrative is clear, concise, and logical. Make sure you're familiar with FinCEN's keywords and use them wherever they're appropriate in your narratives. Use the attachment feature whenever you have multiple transactions, and be sure to refer to the attachment in your narrative. Distinguish new versus continuing activity reports as it makes most sense to you. Consider using a case report tool in order to provide comprehensive supporting documentation to law enforcement and to internal readers. And lastly, never forget that SARs make a tremendous impact on fighting financial crime. Well, thank you again so much for your time today. I hope what I've shared has been helpful and thought-provoking. At this time, we're going to open it up for questions, so I'll turn it back over to Anu.
Great. That's excellent, Laurie. Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate the entire presentation, but what always sticks with me is the personal stories where that your SAR is making a difference. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge and your personal experience. So we've had a lot of questions come in, so I'm going to get started. So upon writing a SAR, who is supposed to review before sending? In the case of a large institution, the head of compliance can certainly not review them all. In small ones, the know-how may not be available. What is the best practices? What is the best practice before filing?
Well, that definitely depends on the size of the institution, the size of your staff, etc. It should be reviewed by at least one other person. If the staff is so big and you have so many SARs that you can't possibly have a supervisor review them, then perhaps they could be cross-referenced or reviewed by a more senior AML analyst. But someone definitely needs to review that as well. Now, at my institution, we had a smaller staff, but I reviewed every SAR and the SAR, especially the SAR form itself. And my boss, who was director of regulatory compliance, he would review the case report just so that he got a sense of what was going on and what customers were involved, etc. So it's really the best practice I can give you is that at least one other person with more experience should review the SAR first. That's my best response there.
Yeah, I think every institution has to approach it based on their individual situation.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like it doesn't always have to be the head of compliance, but at least somebody else who is knowledgeable on filing SARs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here's a question around balance. So how do you make sure that you find the right balance between filing in case anything goes wrong and filing based on real suspicion? Can the former case lead to fines to the institution for being too cautious?
I'm sorry, I knew your audio broke up there, so I didn't hear all of the question.
Oh, for sure. Let me do it again. So the question was around balance. How do you balance between filing in case anything goes wrong and filing based on real suspicion? Can the former lead to fines to the institution for being too cautious?
Yes, we call that, I'm trying to think of what
Like a
sort of a
CYA?
CYA, yeah.
There we go.
But there used to be a term for that, um, but which I can't think of off the top of my head. But I think it is important to really think about the case, the situation, the details, and whether the institution, and get several people's opinion on this, especially if your case is presented to several people in compliance to see what their opinion is about whether this is really SAR worthy or not. What I always tried to do was just that. And in some cases, I felt that a SAR was not necessary because we had no information to provide to law enforcement. Yet, in certain cases, I was overruled on that. But I personally felt that if we had no names, no telephone numbers, no information at all to provide to law enforcement, then there's no point in filing a SAR. So this happened especially on fraud cases. So let's say we had someone that phoned our customer service line trying to impersonate our customer and saying that they wanted to do a wire transfer, which happened fairly often. And our customer service reps were very good at recognizing these. We recorded all of our incoming phone calls on that line, and they didn't get away with anything. Well, would we file a SAR on that suspicious activity? Well, no, because we don't know who the person was that was calling. We couldn't tell the phone number they were calling from. They were unsuccessful at processing a transaction. So just because it happened doesn't mean that there's anything of value there to provide to law enforcement. And in the case that I described, where we had the fax, the fraudulent fax, because of that person's name in the fax header, that was really the only reason that we filed that SAR. If there had been no other information other than, here's a fax that appears to be coming from our customer, but there's no other information about who did this, then there's no point in filing a SAR because there's nothing to give law enforcement. So I guess in summary, what I would say is look at your case and whether you have any information that you can provide to law enforcement that they can act on, and then go from there.
Yeah, so I think someone just mentioned that it's called defensive filing. Is that what the
Yes,
word you were
that's right.
looking for?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the word you're
defensive
looking
file.
for.
Yeah,
Yes. That sounds more polite.
yes, definitely.
Questions are still coming in, which are great. When we file a SAR, can we include multiple different subjects in one SAR? So the example they've given is, if I have 10 unrelated incidents in 1 week, can I list them all in one SAR, or should I actually be submitting 10 different SARs?
I guess I would expand on that question. If it's all related, if there's 10 different subjects, but it's all related to, say, one customer, then yes, you can certainly include multiple subjects and in fact, the SAR form can accommodate, I don't know how many, probably unlimited number of suspects or subjects, excuse me. We used to call them suspects, and now they've changed that term to subjects. But I would just consider, again, from law enforcement's perspective, what is it that you're trying to tell them about the case? And even though you may have multiple subjects, if it's all related to one customer and sort of a similar flavor of activity, then you could certainly include those all in one SAR. Like an example I just thought of was I had a case where we had a customer who received a number of wire transfers from individuals in China, and they were all around the same dollar amount, but they were received throughout a couple week period. And each individual was only sending one wire. So I think I had about 12 or 15 subjects that were sending the incoming wires. And then, of course, our customer who was receiving them was also a subject. So, but because the activity was all very similar and appeared to be related, we did include all of that in one single SAR.
Okay, very good. Now this is for Canadian jurisdiction, but maybe does the 90-day monitoring period for continuity SAR exist for FinTech? I don't know if you know that one.
I do not know the answer to
I
that,
don't know if
no.
I know that one right now. I think we would have to research with FinTech on that one. But here's another question on the 90 days. So within the 90 days, the suspect opens a new account and conducts the same activity. Would we do a continuing or a new report?
I would call that continuing
Okay.
because it's the same characterization of activity. And actually, the fact that they opened a new account and started doing it out of a new account is even more suspicious.
Yeah, that's very
So
alarming.
yeah, so I would say yes, definitely include all that in the same SAR. And as you're setting up your monitoring system, making sure that you're capturing everything at that customer level. So even if they open yet another account, that
Yeah.
your monitoring and your alerts will be able to capture anything that's going on with that customer and within their whole group of all accounts they have.
So if you're continuing a SAR report, should the narrative from the original SAR be included?
No, and that's a very good question. So what we would do, or what you want to do, is in your first sentence, say this is a report of continuing activity
Yeah.
observed by, and then just in a sentence or two say, let me see if I use that example of, let's say in the poorly written SAR narrative that we used, my dry cleaner, say something like, this is a continuing activity SAR, re reporting continuing activity by customer so-and-so regarding wire transfers to Venezuela. It's something to that effect. And then it's also important to name or identify in that continuing activity narrative, and this again is for US participants here, the BSA ID number, date, and amount of your original SAR. Because on the SAR form itself, whenever you check that box that says continuing activity, you're required to enter the BSA ID for the last SAR that you filed. So law enforcement readers can see that. They can see the last SAR that you filed. But if, say, this is your third continuing activity SAR, they can't see it takes them a lot longer to figure out what the original SAR was for.
Yeah.
SAR ID was for. So if you put that in there, that's very helpful to them as well. And then they can go back and refer to the previous SAR narratives, but you only want to capture in this current SAR narrative a summary, again, of why it's suspicious and emphasize the fact that it's ongoing, and then add in the additional details of what is the continuing activity that you're seeing
Okay.
and any new nuances that may have come up.
Uh, in the case of identity theft, what should we register in step 3, which is the subject information, since the data is from the victim?
So in section 3 of the suspect or the subject, if you don't have any information, you don't list any information. In other
Okay.
words, in the case of fraud where your customer is the victim, you do not list your customer as a subject in the SAR. The subject section is intended to be only for participants in the illegal activity. So in money laundering cases, typically your customer is an active participant in that activity. So you would list your customer as well as any other parties. But in fraud cases where your customer is the victim, you do not want to list them as a subject. And so in those cases, I believe there is a checkbox that says no subjects unidentifiable or something to that effect.
Would you still file a SAR for that?
Well, I guess it would depend on the details.
Okay.
So if funds were actually stolen or some kind of harm actually came to the victim, you would definitely want to report that. But if it was the activity was caught and nothing happened, Because it was caught by the bank's processes and no money went out of the bank, then that's questionable whether you would file a SAR if you have no other information. Now, if you did have something to the effect of identifying that the customer, say, got a suspicious email that they identified that they clicked on a link or there was hacking involved, anything like that, there is more information that you can provide.
Okay.
But it all kind of depends on the details of the case.
Okay. There's a lot of questions around case reports. So
Okay.
in your opinion, do you create case reports for unusual activity where you decide not to produce a SAR?
Yes, that's a very good question, because it's important to document if your alert system or something came up that is unusual and you ultimately decide not to file a SAR, you need to document the reason why. And it could be something as simple as, we have no information of any value to provide to law enforcement. But somewhere, either in your, sometimes a case report may not be necessary. Say an alert was generated, but you investigate it and you have no information to provide, then you can simply document that in your case management system and you don't need a case report because there's not a lot of detail. But if there was sufficient detail, you will need to document that, why you chose not to file the SAR. And typically examiners will ask you for a list of incidents where you actually decided not to file a SAR. I know my examiners ask me for that every year.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so we actually kept a log as well, just as an easy reference of every case where we decided not to file a SAR, and then we had our supporting documentation that we could refer to.
As to why you didn't file the SAR?
Right, as to why we did not file, yes.
Okay. Okay. So any recommendations or practices for sharing actionable information with local law enforcement outside of SARs? So the attendee in this case says, our local law enforcement office doesn't have direct access to FinCEN database, but we may want to inform them directly of certain fraud situations. I don't know if you have any experience in that.
Yes, actually, it's a very good practice, compliance people at banks, to make a connection with your local law enforcement. Make sure they know you and that you know them. And not only local law enforcement, but if you have a local field office of the FBI, or even Homeland Security. Now, I'm based in Denver, Colorado, so I actually had contacts at the FBI and Homeland Security that I would call not only when I had a questionable case that I wanted to confirm, I would even confirm with them sometimes, would this be something you would want to see a SAR on? As well as reporting to them any important activity that they may want to act on immediately. So a phone call is sufficient, in my opinion, for that, in that respect. And you can, because it's in the United States, it's acceptable to communicate the existence of a SAR to law enforcement. You're protected in doing that in the safe harbor rules. You can report the existence of a SAR to law enforcement. Then if they don't have access to the FinCEN database, they can then reach out to a different agency, either local FBI or whomever, IRS criminal investigations, to then take that case further. But I think law enforcement does appreciate when we as compliance professionals actually reach out to them directly with particularly hot cases, as a friend or contact that I had and I actually got to know him sort of as a friend in Homeland Security. He would say, yes, call us whenever you have a particularly hot case, and we will make sure that let us know when you filed the SAR, and then we'll go look for it and pursue it from there.
So you provide this, you don't provide details, you provide a SAR number to the local enforcement agency.
Right. And I would describe it to them in general.
Okay.
Of what's going on, and why I think it's especially important that they review it. And this way they can wade through all the thousands and thousands of other SARs and go directly to it so that they can take a look at it in detail and decide if they want to pursue it.
Okay.
Yeah, they love it when you do that,
Oh,
honestly.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah.
Can you provide some examples on how to decide on the filing names?
Well, I guess that depends on your automated system and how you're filing the SAR, but um, I think we usually we would use a case number that was generated by our system and a date, possibly, and then I'm trying to remember because I think our automated system actually created its own file name,
Okay.
and then there were with the attachment feature. Depending on how your automated system works, if it files SARs for you, it may have specific parameters around how you name the SAR filing and then how you name the attachment to that SAR filing, the
Yeah.
CSV file.
Is there a limit on how many SARs you can write and submit, especially in a closing quarter or the year?
No, as far as
I
I
don't think
know.
so. No, I don't think
Mm-mm.
so. You can submit as many, but I
Yeah,
think they have to be thoughtful. Is that sort of a general
right.
guidance?
Yeah, you'd want to avoid the defensive filing
Yes.
perspective. Um,
After you have created a continuous SAR and still have the same activity after, do you create a new or continuous?
so as I talked about, you would want to, if you've got this, it's the exact same thing going on. You have the same players, you have the same nature of activity. That's when you want, and you've filed an original SAR already. That's when you want to, when you file your next SAR, you want to check that continuing activity box. And then as I just mentioned from the previous question, in your narrative, say, this is a continuing activity report, and this is a summary of why this is suspicious, and then here's the new details
Okay.
in your narrative.
The next question is, should the FI or listed business be notified by the law enforcement agencies that their SAR was received?
If you file electronically, FinCEN sends back, first they send back something that acknowledges that they received it. And then usually within a couple of days, FinCEN then sends another message to you, the filing institution, that they've processed it and it's been accepted. In other words, there weren't any flaws in the data. There weren't any missing data fields or any bad data in it. So then that's when you know it's been accepted. And that's when that, what they call the BSA ID number is assigned.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of electronic filing is that that becomes more automated.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there anywhere we can go to get a listing of FinCEN keywords? I think that's on their website.
Yes, and actually on the slide where I talked about that, I actually have the URL
The URL. Okay.
to that exact page.
Yeah. So when we send the slides out, you'll be able to click. You'll be able to see that link and click on it. So that should give you the direct page where you can get that information.
Yeah, and it's a great page. It's got, I think if you go on just on the general FinCEN website and do a search, then just search the key terms or keywords or something like that, then it should pull that page up for you. And it's very thorough. It lists them in date order, the keywords that are to be used, and then an actual hyperlink to the full advisory that describes the activity and what they're looking for. So it's very
Okay.
helpful.
How many days should you watch a customer before creating a SAR that their activity is suspicious?
The key date from FinCEN's perspective is the date that you decide to file the SAR.
Okay.
So in other words, you can usually set your automated monitoring systems to produce alerts on a particular frequency. So in my bank, we had our alerts generate once a month for that previous month's activity. And then all of our analysts would work through all those alerts during that following month. So that date the decision to file is made is really when the clock starts for all of your filing.
Okay.
So I would say, again, this is a very subjective sort of thing, but depending on what kind of suspicious activity you noted with your customer, you may want to file the SAR immediately, or if you want to see if it's going to happen again to determine whether it's suspicious, because sometimes one transaction, for example, depending on the characteristics of it, it may or may not be suspicious. But then, so you may want to hold that and in sort of a pending status to see if it happens again or if anything related to that happens, and then make your decision to file the SAR.
So I guess having internal conversations and looking at your company policies and procedures would be something that would weigh into it?
Yes, definitely. And so as within a compliance department, I guess as well, depending on the size, I think it's important for everyone to talk about their cases and their alerts. And if they have something they're not sure about, to bring that up to a supervisor. To say, hey, I've got this and I'm just not sure about it. What do you think?
Yeah.
And talk about it amongst yourselves, because someone may have seen something similar in their work
Yeah.
that they may have, you may not be aware of, and so they have that additional experience. So it's just good to talk it through amongst the compliance staff.
I'm not sure if you know this one, but it says, coming from a wire transfer company, sometimes our SARs have over 200 persons. Filing the PDF takes time and sometimes it crashes. Can I add an attachment for some of them as opposed to creating a person profile 200 times?
Yeah, I think you probably could. You'd want to make sure that you emphasize that in your narrative, though. So perhaps if it's, and again, I'm kind of, but if you have if it's a single customer who is receiving all these wires or sending wires to over 200 people, you could list your customer as the subject. And then in the narrative, describe how you have listed in an attachment to the SAR all of the recipients or senders of the various wire transfers.
Okay. What if the same patron begins utilizing a different tactic? Would that be a continuing SAR or a new initial filing based on the different activity?
That's a good one. And actually, I had that happen at once. I had a very big case where I had a customer who had this pattern of, actually it was the one that I talked about with the Sony home theater system, where they would get these wire transfers through banks in Latvia and Estonia, from shell companies in various bank secrecy havens. And they all had a very similar flavor. And ultimately, when the customer was eventually approached about it, all the activity stopped. And then what we started to see about a month or two after was they did change their behavior, and they started moving money was coming into them from Asia and through individuals in Asia. And so we called that a new SAR, a new case. But in our, and that brings up another important point, if you have a customer who has had multiple SARs filed on them, it's important to note that in the narrative as well. So I would actually, in that particular example I had, if my new SAR or my new case regarding the activity from Asia, I would also state in my narrative, this customer is the subject of multiple SARs, and just a short synopsis, as well as including the most recent BSA ID number and date and amount of those other SARs filed on them. So that way the law enforcement can see, yeah, this is a customer that's got a lot of stuff going on. And if we want to see the whole big picture, we can refer to these other SARs that have been filed on this customer. So that really emphasizes to law enforcement that this is somebody you really want to take a look at, because a lot of stuff's going on with them. But to answer the question, I think if it's truly dramatically different, you do need to start a new case, create a new SAR series, and but cross-reference them both.
Cross-reference, yeah.
Yeah.
Here's a casino question. I'm not sure if you can answer this. When submitting a SAR from a casino on an unknown patron for bill stuffing in a gaming machine, how does defense filing work?
Boy, I really cannot answer that
Yeah.
question. I'm not even quite sure what bill stuffing is.
Okay.
But
Maybe
but I'm
we'll see if we
uh,
can find an expert in for the
uh-huh.
casinos and see if we can answer that question.
Yeah.
If a SAR is reported to regulatory bodies and we go back to the customer for further details or foreclosure account, is that considered tipping off?
If you have a policy, which I know many institutions do, of how you're going to close an account if they've had multiple SARs filed on them, that is certainly within the bank's purview. Sometimes law enforcement will tell you that they want you to leave the account open, but more than likely, they're not going to give you any advice on that in that
Hmm.
regard. This has been something that's been sort of frustrating for me over the years as well, because it would go to the point of law enforcement would contact me regarding a SAR or series of SARs, and I would ask them, over the phone as we're talking about this case, do you want us to ask the customer any questions? Do you want us to, our normal policy is to close the account. Do you want us to leave it open? Sometimes they'll say leave it open, but more than likely they're going to say that's up to you.
Okay.
Because I think they don't want to get involved in influencing the bank one way or the other.
Yeah.
But in asking questions of the customer or the subject, the concept of tipping off is it's very real and it's very nuanced. And in that example I just spoke about a minute or so ago, it was kind of a complex situation about, so it was sort of it was the customer of another institution that we processed all their transactions for. And so we were filing the SARs on that. But I think how you ask the question, it needs to be very generic. For example, we used to just say, we'd like to understand the business purpose of this transaction. So something very generic like that. And then just wait and see what they said and see if it makes sense.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up soon. So if you had a suspicious activity, but then it goes over the 90-day review, but then starts a year later, would you reference that previous SAR that has been filed and begin a new series?
Yeah, so that's where that nuance of is this continuing or not comes into play. And my own personal opinion is that if it's exactly the same sender, receiver, amount, all of that, and it's even a year later, I still personally believe that that is a continuing activity report, even though it's been a year, and that law enforcement would want to know that. But if you feel more comfortable filing it as new, then definitely state in your narrative that although indicates a new SAR, this activity is identical to previous activity that occurred, state the date, and was filed under this SAR number. So you give them the BSA ID and SAR ID there. So then they at least know from your narrative that this is continuing, or this is exactly like what you've seen in the past, but it's just been a long time since you saw it.
Okay. So I think one final question here. Is it appropriate to use the customer name as the filing name?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that one. If the filing name is the name of the electronic file that's being submitted, I'm not sure that that would necessarily be appropriate. I think you'd want to keep the customer name out of the file name as much as possible. Unless
Okay.
it's something, if it's just your internal files that you're storing, yeah, there's no problem there. But anything that you would submit to FinTech, I would think you would want to keep the customer name out of it and just stick with case numbers and dates and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Mm,
You really want to make sure you're on the right side of privacy laws.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I think we should wrap it up. Once again, I'd like to thank Laurie for leading today's webinar and providing her first-hand experience. This now concludes our presentation, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.